Gerald Pfeffer. I work here for the training center of the ILO here in Turin and Italy, and I'm part of the team that together with the colleagues in ILO Geneva, the EU and the OECD has developed this capacity building event. It's already the second time that we are organizing this event, which is specifically tailored to this growing need amongst national contact points for responsible business conduct to learn more and to access the resources and expertise within the ILO, within the International Labour Organization. Huh? So before we start here with the course and with the agenda, some etiquette here, our digital housekeeping. Huh? Please mute your microphone, of course, when you're not speaking, huh? But mute your microphone. The camera, it's optional. See what works best for you. I don't think it really affects your, when you have a good bandwidth, you can keep on your camera, whatever works best for you. Please do use this Zoom chat box function. We see that this works the best. Huh? If you have any comment, observation, you would like to share some resources, or you have comments or specific questions, please use it. Use the chat box function. Our experience is that this is the best way to get a certain level of interaction in the virtual world. Huh? And then finally, this webinar is being recorded, and we will make it available on the ILO's eCampus, which most of you already have accessed, and which you can access, of course, during the duration of the course and also afterwards. So we will make it available, this recording. The agenda for the day, I already shared it with you in our communications through email that we had in the weeks leading up to today. Huh? But what is on the agenda for today's sessions, which will exceptionally, it will last today until 4:30, 4:30. Normally, we are looking at webinar sessions that will take 1 hour and a half up to 2 hours. But since today we had different objectives to cover, it will take a bit longer. Huh? I will be providing for the next 10-20 minutes an introduction to the course, the expectations, the objectives, and also how to use the eCampus. Before I would like to give the floor to our three guests that not only provided great support in the preparations of this course, but also play a very important role in today's environment concerning responsible business. I'm very pleased that we will have with us Ms. Madeleine Tuininga from the European Commission, Professor Kaufmann, and Madame Gita Roelants from the International Labour Organization. We asked them to set the stage today, the context and the background on responsible business and decent work. Today also we will have, after these three interventions, we will have a short virtual coffee break. I think it's a good idea that we can stretch our legs, grab a cup of coffee or tea before we go to our first technical session of the day, which is an introduction to the ILO and its normative system and international labor standards, which is the backbone of responsible, the labor dimension of responsible business. And for that purpose, we invited Ms. Emily Sims, who is not only a great colleague, but also the coordinator of the ILO Help Desk for Business. She will have an intervention of around 45 minutes up to an hour. And then at 4:30, we will have the closing of the first webinar. So we already was chit-chatting before we officially started about Turin and the Turin campus. Also, a few of us mentioned it also on the introduction forum. Yeah, it's all fine having a virtual online training course, but we prefer actually to go to the ILO training campus here in Turin. For those that have been here, and I see a few names that I know for sure that already were here in Turin, but for those that don't know it, this is the beautiful city of Turin, which also hosts the ILO training center here. If I don't know if you know the city, but it's here The training campus is next to the River Po and to the big next to the big square building here. Huh? It's a beautiful city. It's also a beautiful campus. We hope to receive very soon participants. But in the meanwhile, I invite you, if you haven't done it yet, have a look at the website of the International Training Center of the ILO, which is full with learning resources on sustainable development and decent work. Huh? Good. It's very difficult to virtually create a lot of interaction. That's also why I asked you to introduce yourself on the eCampus as the pre-course activities, and also to to complete a training survey. I think around 35 participants have completed this learning survey, and it gives us some interesting information. First of all, we have in the room now 25 different nationalities, of which 14 are coming from the European Union. So we are already scoring very well in terms of diversity. Another question also was, to which institution do you belong, or does your national contact point belong? And that was also very interesting to see the big diversity to which your institution is attached. Majority of the NCPs were, or the participants at least, were linked to foreign affairs, state affairs, but the majority to the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, Ministry of Commerce, and then a smaller minority to ministries such as Labor or the Ministry of Employment Creation, a few from the Treasury, and I believe one or two consider themselves to be independent. While the majority of participants indeed are linked to a ministry, I also would like to welcome, we have several employers and workers organizations that also registered for the course, and I'm sure that will really provide for very interesting discussions and different perspectives on this topic of responsible business conduct. So an extra welcome for our workers and employers representatives that will be with us in the next 3 to 4 weeks. We also asked them, what is the kind of experience that you have working for your NCP? And while we have people that have worked more than 20 years within their NCP, we also have people that only started working for the NCP only a few months ago. But on average, we have 3 to 4 years of experience working on the topic of responsible business and working for the national contact point. And then finally, another question was, well, how well do you know the M&E Declaration, the ILO M&E Declaration? How familiar are you with the declaration and its operational tools? And with 1 being very familiar and 5 no knowledge at all, an average score here was 3.5. So we already, it's good to know that we have some notions about the ILO M&E Declaration, but we are hungry for more knowledge on the topic. So that is good to know. Now, I also ask you, what are the expectations that you have for this event? Because I can imagine that getting suddenly this invitation to attend this training, it also creates some expectations. And before I start talking again, maybe it's a good moment to give the floor to some of you and to listen to you in what were your expectations of participating in this event. So I will just pick a few names. You cannot hide, you cannot run and hide. So, and maybe I have here Annick with us, who also has her camera on. So Annick, maybe could you please tell me your name, where you're coming from, and then maybe say something about your expectations to this course. Annick.
Hello, everyone. I'm Annick from the Belgian employers in the private sector. And I am a lawyer, and I am active in collective bargaining. So I know ILO also very well, because normally every year for 6 years now, I come to the ILO Commission for the Application of the Standards as an IOE member, active member. So ILO, I know a little bit, but it's the interaction between the MNE declaration and eventually the national contact points, because I'm not formally a member of the national contact point OECD in Belgium, but sometimes I'm invited as an expert. Yes, it's the articulation, a better knowledge of the declaration, because as you know, ILO standards are for member states, and the declaration is a specific instrument in ILO, and I want to know more about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Annick. So how did they fit together? And specifically more on the ILO MNE declaration. Thank you, Annick. Let's maybe go to Thomas. Yes, the surprise on your face, Thomas. Please, you can introduce yourself and your expectations.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tomáš Kozárek. I'm from Czech Republic. I'm working for Ministry of Industry and Trade. I'm head of the International Law Unit, and I'm a member of the Czech NCP Secretariat. Well, for me, the biggest expectation is to learn more about the work ILO in RBC area, because RBC is a topic with growing importance, and it's broadly discussed on many forums. And unfortunately, I don't have so many or such a big knowledge about its work in this area. So I'm happy to learn something new, something more, something exciting.
Okay, thank you, Thomas. Let's go to John at the other side of the planet. John.
Oh, thanks, Carl. Look, my first contact with the ILO was when I was working with Burmese organisations many years ago, and the ILO did a very important report on forced labour there, and it was one of the few institutions internationally that wasn't, I guess, held up by politics, and it was so important for the Burmese organisations, and it's just such sad news of what we're seeing there today, and perhaps the ILO will have to be called upon again. I hope not. But yeah, really looking forward to learning a lot from everyone here. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, John. Let's go here to Marianne. Marianne? You can put on your camera also. Hi, Marianne.
Yes, hi. My name is Marianne. I came from Belgium. I am from the Belgian National Contact Point. Hello to Yannick. Since for 1 year, I am the secretary from the Belgian National Contact Point. Before, I was legal advisor in the Ministry of Social Affairs. And in this function, I was used to work with the ILO Convention, and I work on the protocol against forced labor. But I am always interested to learn more about the link between the ILO declaration and the OECD guidelines. And I am interested to build network with the other partners to this training, and to learn more about the practice, the implementation of the ILO declaration.
Thank you. Thank you, Marianne. Let's have maybe one or two more. I see here Marina. Marina, could you also connect your camera if possible? Not necessary. And introduce yourself and your expectations.
So can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, and I see something from the Lion King, but it's okay.
Oh, hello, thank you very much for this seminar. I am Marina from Ukraine NCP. I've been working in our NCP since for 3 years, and actually labor legislation is quite difficult for me, and it's very important for me now to get knowledge about the ILO declaration, and to listen to another participants about their experience in these fields. And so thank you very much.
Thank you. And then maybe for the final, because we cannot, of course, it will be difficult to introduce all 46 of you, but I'm sure everybody will have a moment to come in. If it's not in this webinar, it will be in the next webinar where we can have a few more introductions. But I would like to hand over now to Tanya from Norway. Hi, Tanya.
Hello, everybody. I was invited to this course from my colleagues in the Norwegian OECD focal point. I am a lawyer working in the Ministry of Labour and Social Affairs. I'm the head of the Norwegian ILO committee, and I represent Norway at the governing body and at the conference. I have been doing this for about 1.5 years, so it's still quite new to me. And I'm very happy that my colleague invited me to join. So I'm really looking forward to this. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. Of course, I would like to ask everybody to go to the eCampus and have a look at the introductions. And if you haven't introduced yourself, please go ahead. It's a first way of breaking the ice and getting to know each other. If possible, put a picture of the view out of your window or the city where you're residing currently, so to just bring some more color and diversity to that discussion forum. And it's also something which we really want to use a bit more, this discussion forum. So of course, these expectations, they are no surprise. I went through the list and I picked out some common threads in terms of expectations. Indeed, how does the ILO work? But even more importantly, what is the aim and the objective of the ILO MNE declaration? To get more knowledgeable how the practical use of the MNE declaration and how it is being implemented. Learn from the ILO experience in terms of responsible business conduct and what could be the use of these experiences for you as an NCP. And then also more, and this is of course one of the reasons that we are organizing this course, how can they work better together? They are not competing instruments, but they probably work at best when they are nicely configured. Then the efficiency will greatly increase. This was also how, of course, the course was developed and designed. And let me start with the output or the ultimate objective of this course is yes, we want to come to more synergies, more collaboration, and more coherence between the work what you as NCPs are doing at the country level at a daily basis, the work of the OECD, the work of the ILO through its declaration and guidelines, and the European Commission. And how do we want to get there? Well, by providing you as much as possible, knowledge as possible on what the ILO is doing, what are our relevant ILO standards and instruments and tools that we have available in relation to responsible business. Secondly, developing this community of practice. Especially now in days of COVID, of social distancing. How can we still work together, learn with each other on this topic of responsible business, and especially learning from each other? Because I'm sure there's a lot of knowledge that we already have here in this virtual space. And then secondly, building bridges between the NPCs, but also between the NPCs, the OECD, and the ILO. And how can we nurture and strengthen these networks in the days, months, and years to come. So how do we translate this into a timetable? Normally, this would be a 1-week course here in Turin, 5 days. So we now distribute it over 3 weeks. 5 days here in Turin, we distribute it over 3 weeks, where we have webinars, we have meet the experts and assignments. As you can see, we have in total 7 what we call the technical webinars, which are really learning webinars. We will have 3 this week, and next week and the week after we will have 2 of them, 7 in total. In addition to that, we also decided to develop what we call Meet the Expert, which are more informal Zoom discussions where we invited colleagues of us from the ILO in Geneva that are recognized to be leading experts on certain topics. In the second week, we will have Ben Smith talking on child labor, and Mr. Martin Oels on Convention 169 on Indigenous Peoples. The idea is that these Meet the Expert sessions they're less formal. It's more like a dialogue, and they will be more driven by specific questions that you might have. The idea is really to have a dialogue with them on some issues, burning issues that you might have on the ground. So that's what we will be doing mainly in the first 2 weeks, this week, next week. The third week, from 15 to 19 of February, is the week we really want to see now, okay, I think we all will be convinced that we can work more and better and more integrated, but what can we do now? What are the kind of activities, initiatives that we can design to reach that goal? And that will be part of our third week of discussion, where we really will more focus on defining these elements. We will have sessions here again with Ms. Roelands and with Ms. Hennis, but we also invited other NPCs that participated in our course in 2019, and they will come in also and share what they have done in the past year and a half on promoting collaboration between the NCPs and the ILO. And then on the 19th of February, this is what we call the closing webinar, and that's where we want to hear from you what will be done. That's where we will be eager to hear from you what are the kind of different initiatives and ideas that can be brought forward to reach the goal and objective of this training session. Very important still, before I hand over to our three guests, is the eCampus. I don't think there is any problem. Everybody was easily entering into the eCampus, which is good because all the materials, all the resources, all the video recordings will be made available on our eCampus, which will be there for an indefinite for the next 12 months for sure. You will be able to access all the learning materials that are there. As indicated, if you cannot attend one of the webinar sessions, it's not a problem. You will find the next day the recording of the webinar session, so you can access it at your own time and moment. Ideally, if we are really participating well, you will be eligible to get this certificate of participation if you wish. It's not our purpose to police the participation of participants, but we will monitor it a little bit. And then at the end of the 3 weeks, you will be able to download the training certificate. Good. Let's now continue because I'm watching at the clock. Yes, first of all, I would like to ask Ms. Teuninger, is Madeline here with us?
I am with you.
Hi, Madeline.
Hi, I'm putting on my video. I hope it works.
Yes,
well?
I hear you very well, and I also can see you very well. Madeline, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. And Madeline is the head, I hope this is the correct, head of the unit for trade and sustainable development of the European Commission. And Madeline, the floor is yours. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much for being here. It's indeed a pity that I can't see all of you, but I have seen the list of participants, and I'm very impressed. So I'm really delighted to be here with you. And thanks for so many participants, actually from across the globe, to this training. And I'm particularly pleased to join this opening session with Gita Roelands and Christine Kaufmann. So this is the second time we have this training. The project undertook a first-time training of OECD national contact points for responsible business conduct in EU member state. And this was part of an effort to enhance international policy coherence on the labor dimension of responsible business conduct. That first training took place in September 2019, and it was a huge success. We had a very high satisfaction score. both on content, but I believe also because of the network opportunities. Of course, that was a physical meeting at that time, something we have forgotten now about, but I believe that the ILO is, if I listen to how you set this up now, you've really gained experience in how to move to online successful training. So that's an exciting perspective for this second training. What I remember from that first course was that it really clearly filled also a need and a demand. The second one was actually intended to take place last year, but we were still in the middle of the crisis, so it was moved to now. Not that we are fully out of the crisis, but I think we are now more able to run business. And as said, the first one was focused on EU member states. I believe that Morocco also participated, but we have, whether to us through our FTA discussions, but also I believe that OECD and the ILO through other projects that we have received clear indication of the wider interest, hence a broader setting now. Now, what I do want to say is that the fact that we are here is 95% the result of two colleagues who saw the importance of the national contact points and who realized the need to link NCPs and create a network, share knowledge and build capacity. And one is here with me on the panel, that's Gita Roeland. And the other is a former DG Trade colleague, Sarah Gondi, who's now with the ILO on the green agenda. And I want to applaud them because their enthusiasm and vision has been instrumental for this. And I wholeheartedly thank them for their tireless efforts. Certainly also thanks to Gita's team, who I know have been really very, very busy with trying to make a new successful formula online of this training. So the training as such, and I referred already to it, and you too, Carl, in your introduction, the training is part of EU projects. The EU supports this training course to national contact points as part of our Trade for Decent Work project with the ILO. This is a unique project and sets out a collaboration with the ILO, with the EU and with partner countries on labor matters. It covers 14 countries, up from 3, I believe, last or before last year. And it also includes horizontal actions such as due diligence and responsible business conduct. Beyond this, we also have close cooperation through other projects on responsible business conduct involving both the ILO and the OECD. To mention one is a project that we have with regional projects, one in Asia with 6 countries participating, and one in Latin America with 8 countries participating. And then on top of it, we also have a garment project with the OECD on RBC. So needless to say that we are here and do all these projects because the topic is very important. The EU is a strong supporter of responsible business conduct and due diligence, and we see a clear role of governments to accompany this work. To make this work, NCPs play a key role. They have a key role in helping companies by providing guidance and ensuring consistent application, but they also have a key role in the resolution of conflicts. There's also an important role of international cooperation with the ILO, with the OECD, with the UN, and with member countries. For labor, without any doubt, the ILO is a critical player in helping to supervise the ILO standards, the supervising role of the ILO standards, and assisting governments and business, like the ILO help desk, with implementation. Business is, of course, also an important player and play a key role. And I would say that we've seen an evolution in the relevance of responsible business conduct, also from a business perspective. Over the last 5 years, with an acceleration over the COVID crisis. Indeed, the crisis exposed an enormous vulnerability of supply chains. Some companies have come out better out than others, but the impact throughout the supply chain on workers at the end of the supply chain have been devastating. Orders stopped, people have been laid off, big brands and small brands have been playing a role and have been affected. Clearly, and also you only need to open the regular ILO reports on the crisis. From a labor protection perspective, there has been and there is a clear crisis. But within the crisis, there is also new initiatives taken up, and I would say a new impetus. We've clearly seen a new impetus to the whole role of RBC and due diligence. Some lessons learned from the COVID crisis in the relevance of this topic is, I would nearly describe it that where we were 5-6 years ago, most of our discussions, often with companies, were really about this is compliance with a legal framework. And the notion of moving from a legal compliance to a responsibility beyond legal requirements, strict legal requirements, was a new notion. And we've made a lot of progress on that over the past 5 years. But I would say that the crisis really has shifted this debate even further to a resilience of supply chain. So in other words, businesses who have taken up on sustainability as part of their long-term strategy have come better through the crisis. In other words, it makes eminent sense. So we see this acceleration of the importance of resilience of supply chains and the role of sustainability in that. And although we've been doing a lot, the push for developing further instruments is very strong. What we have now is the basis, the UN, the guidelines in the UN, the ILO and the OECD. At EU level, we also have some legislation. We have a non-financial reporting directive, and we have, as applied as of 1 January this year, the conflict mineral regulation. But there's a lot in development. The EU is developing mandatory due diligence legislation that would be applicable horizontally across companies, sectors, and topics. Evidently including labor, basing our experience on the ILO and the OECD. Then we are reviewing the non-financial reporting directive, which is about sustainability reporting. And the revision is to introduce and develop European standards in sustainability reporting and defining that in more detail. Internationally, the EU is very active in the OECD, ILO, and the UN, and through, hence, the representation of somebody from DG Trade, through our trade agreements, we are very active. Actually, RBC is among the priority topics in our trade and sustainable development chapters. We also see an increasing recognition of the important role of multi-stakeholders involvement. For example, we launched a cocoa initiative with Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, which includes a due diligence dimension for forced labor and also deforestation. Another example is the support to the multi-stakeholders platform in the context of the OECD responsible sourcing of minerals. And of course, there are several of such initiatives, including in member states and international partners. I hope I've convinced you, if you were not already, how important the role of NCPs is to accompany companies and in helping consistent and coherent implementation of the guidelines. With that, I wish you all a fruitful training. You have a packed program. And I hope this training extends also your networks, and with that we contribute to creating a true international community amongst NCPs. I'm looking forward to hear also from you what you need from us, how we can help you to fulfill the tasks of NCPs, whether it is transfer of knowledge, capacity building, networking, sharing best practices. And I also hope to hear from you how your experience can contribute to our further efforts. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madeleine, for these words. And I would like now to hand over to Professor Christine Kaufmann, who is chair of the Working Party on Responsible Business Conduct. Please, Christine, you can put on your camera, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Carl, and also many thanks to the European Union and the ILO colleagues who organized this seminar. I think it could hardly be more timely, and I'm extremely pleased to have the opportunity to shed some light on the specific environment that NCPs are living in, are working in when it comes to labor rights. It was mentioned already by Madeleine, and I think we all know we live in a time of globalization, and globalization, of course, has helped to facilitate the better quality of life, but it goes also hand in hand with the growing complexity of global supply chains, corporate structures, subcontracting practices, and on top of that, we have digitalization. And I was just thinking when we did the introduction before we started, who would have thought, even 2 years ago, that we would one day all be working or almost all be teleworking from home? Who would have thought that algorithms would take decisions that have an impact on our daily life, so that full supply chains would be completely automated? 2 years ago or 3 years ago, people would have thought, we're not visionary, we're just crazy people. The world has changed so much. And of course, all these challenges, all these developments, they come with very specific challenges for human rights and labor rights, including child labor, forced labor, discrimination, and particularly now with the pandemic, unsafe health and working conditions. Madeleine already mentioned the impact of COVID-19. It just magnifies the challenges that we have been experiencing before. It has severely disrupted, as we all know, global economic activity and supply chain. And I think what's very worrying, and the ILO did wonderful work on that in showing how disproportionate the effects of the pandemic are. We have massive job losses in hard-hit sectors, with a devastating impact of the most vulnerable groups on the one hand, and we have job creation in higher skilled services sectors at the same time. Also, if you look at businesses, and this is important for the work of NCPs, the pandemic is creating enormous challenges. Madeleine mentioned it. We have disrupted supply chains, we have cash flow problems, we have the inability to meet delivery dates, and it leads to unprecedented challenges for companies to even address the negative impacts on workers. And what's particularly worrying, and what we experience now also in the practice of NCPs, is that social dialogue has been under huge pressure. And we see a sharp decrease in meaningful consultations. It is clear from an OECD and from an NCP network perspective that if we want the recovery to be inclusive and work for all, social dialogue will be key. And I think this is a first area where, of course, cooperation with the ILO is absolutely essential. And I mentioned some studies that the ILO did in analyzing the impacts of the pandemic on labor markets. The OECD also did work, and it echoes what Madeleine was just saying. It clearly indicates that companies which are taking proactive steps and apply a responsible business conduct approach, they will do better. They are likely to build more long-term value, they are likely to have more resilient supply chains, and they are more likely to recover in an inclusive and sustainable way. And in other words, I can just repeat what Madeleine was saying, it really pays to apply an RBC approach and going beyond just legal compliance. Now, what we really need now, and I think this refers to the role of business, if we want to address these challenges, we need a very clear message to business, what is expected from them. And a clear message means coherent standards. And I'm very pleased to see that we have the 3 big standards, if I may call them the 3 big ones, aligned. It's the UN Guiding Principles, it's the ILO M&E Declaration, and it's the OECD M&E Guidelines. And in all of this, the European Union, of course, plays a very important role because it incorporates these internationally agreed standards into binding legislation. Already today, as we heard, with several instruments, with the non-financial disclosure directive, with the conflict minerals regulation and ongoing revision, but particularly with the work on introducing mandatory due diligence requirements. If these requirements will be based on international standards, the 3, I think then the European Union gives a very strong signal that goes far beyond the European Union, but in fact to global markets where European companies act and are active. Now, of course, it's always good, and in every presentation I give, and I think all 3 of us, we do the same thing all the time. We talk about coherence and we talk about how important it is that the standards are clear, that the requirements are clear. But of course, that's not good enough. We need to implement these standards and these clear expectations on business. And clearly, due diligence does not always work in practice. And this is where providing effective access to remedy comes into play. And this is where national contact points, as highlighted already by Madeleine, play a very important role. In the last 20 years, they handled over 500 specific instances, covering a very wide range of impacts, issues, and jurisdictions. And if we look at the chapter 5 in the M&E guidelines on employment and industrial relations, it is in fact among the most prevalent themes that dominates the work of NCPs. So we see about 37% of cases referring specifically to the chapter on employment and industrial relations. That is a lot. In addition, it's also important to note that NCPs, they are accessible to a very wide range of actors. We were talking about the importance of involving all the stakeholders. And if we look at who submits these cases, these 500, more than 500 cases to NCPs, we see that since 2011, that's when the guidelines were last revised, over 2/3 of the cases have been submitted by NGOs and trade unions. We have seen among the submitters indigenous communities, individuals, elected officials, for example, also members of national parliaments, even town mayors, industry associations, and companies. So pretty much all stakeholders have at some stage been involved in cases handled by NCPs. If we look at the majority of cases that trade unions filed and that are of particular interest for these seminars, we see that the vast majority dealt with, not surprisingly, the right to organize and the right to bargain collectively. So we're talking about a bit more than 60% of the cases. In terms of sectors, most cases affected food, agriculture, and tobacco. Now, again, these statistics are of course fine, but they do not reflect the specific challenges that NCPs are faced with when handling these cases. And I think that's one of the opportunities that we have with this seminar, to also share experiences on specific cases, to learn from each other and learn across organizations. In many cases, when NCPs are seized with regarding labor issues, social dialogue was not possible or it failed. And there are, I would say, from our studies and our research and our analysis of the different cases, 4 very important elements or features of the NCP mechanism that allow it to play a particularly important role in facilitating and promoting social dialogue. First, NCPs can bring together parties at the right level. They bring complainants together with representatives from senior management to address systemic concerns in labor rights. Second, their focus, the NCP's focus on establishing a dialogue in a non-adversarial setting, is also important, particularly in labor cases where dialogue may be, or even in itself, be the main outcome that is being sought. So quite often we actually see complainants who want to have a dialogue established. That's their main goal. It's not about a substantive outcome in terms of compensation, apology, or something else, just having that dialogue ongoing. The third important feature I think is often overlooked and will be a key issue in this seminar is really that NCPs, they can support the right mediation process. What do I mean by the right mediation process? They have the opportunity to ensure that there is sufficient knowledge of national labor laws, of industrial relation cultures and challenges, but also, of course, about the M&E declaration. So it's NCPs selecting a mediator and making sure that the mediator knows what's at stake, which standards are involved, what does, for example, child labor in an RBC context mean. And the fourth important feature is really that NCPs, the mechanism is very flexible. They have a capacity to focus on forward-looking solutions. So it's not retrospective wrongdoings. It's making sure that in the future, these negative impacts do not happen again. And that turns the whole discussion into a more positive dialogue, which is often easier, especially for business, to engage with. Now, let me just give you a few examples. Of course, I could go on for days with case examples, but I just picked a few. Both Madeline and I mentioned the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on labor issues, and indeed, in April last year, the first COVID-19 related case has been submitted to the French National Contact Point by Uniglobal Union together with its affiliates. They allege that a French company operating call centers, its Teleperformance, did not observe the guidelines in 10 countries. That it had violated workers' rights to health and safety at the workplace, freedom of association, collective bargaining. And very importantly, that the company did not undertake appropriate due diligence in the context of COVID-19. The French NCP accepted the case and is currently in the process of offering its good offices. So definitely a case that shows the importance of the NCP, because an NCP can be seized very quickly. If you want to go to court during a pandemic, it just takes too long. And of course, the workers are already exposed to the risks. So it's an immediate, it's a low-level remedy. Another case handled by the Belgian NCP is interesting. It was about the Belgian-Brazilian brewing company. And it resulted, among other things, in the recognition of trade union representatives. And that shows you what a variety of results can come out of an NCP process. So in some processes, we have a dialogue. Here we have the formal recognition of trade union representatives. Another interesting case is a case that was brought before the German NCP. And here I just want to highlight the potential geographical scope of cases brought to NCPs. I often hear the argument, well, it's only 49, that's not really much. They don't cover, large supply chains, global supply chains, but that's not true. NCPs have handled cases taking place in more than 100 jurisdictions so far. And in fact, in this case, the submitters asked the German NCP to look at the German multinational enterprises doing business in a variety of countries. And in fact, they alleged that workers' rights had been breached in as many as 13 countries, including adhering and non-adhering countries. So the German NCP, together with colleagues from the NCPs in Turkey and Colombia, had to assess this alleged disrespect of workers' rights by a German multinational in as many as 13 adhering and non-adhering countries and across the globe. So all continents except for Australia, sorry, John, were involved in that case. And that shows you, the type of expertise that may be required from an NCP in a specific instance. It also shows you a little bit the limits of the system. Of course, if we have impacts taking place in adhering countries, it's the NCPs of the other countries that will support the lead NCP. But if we have non-adhering countries, it can be really valuable to touch base with ILO colleagues, the ILO who often has offices in the region and can then also bring in their expertise and again make sure that this assessment of labor rights is accurate. And this brings me back to coherence. I think the examples show very clearly, as limited as they are, which important role the NCPs can play on the ground, and they can really contribute in a very concrete way to improve workers' situation. They also show that the flexibility of the NCP system gives them a lot of freedom in defining and addressing the parties' specific needs for remedies in a specific context. However, NCPs do have to apply the OECD guidelines, and they have to apply the guidelines in a consistent way, and they also should operate in a coherent manner. And operating in a coherent manner includes applying the guidelines in the light of the MNE declaration, the ILO, because the guidelines do actually refer to that ILO MNE declaration. This does not mean that NCPs should interpret the ILO MNE declaration itself or rely directly on the ILO conventions, but they should bring these instruments in and act in a coherent way. Now, let me conclude. I think it's obvious that for NCPs to stay ahead of all these developments that the pandemic, that digitalization, globalization brings about, is not an easy task. At the same time, we all learn a lot from the practice of NCPs. And if I say we, it goes beyond the OECD. It's the ILO, it's the UN, it's the European Union, and vice versa. And we see that at the moment in the OECD, while we are taking stock of whether the OECD guidelines are still relevant and fit for purpose, we rely to a considerable extent on NCP cases. And remaining, of course, in sync with this current development also means fostering coherence. I think it's one of the buzzwords of our discussions these days, coherence with the most important standards in the field, the UNGP, the ILO MNE declaration, and the OECD guidelines, and of course, in new legislation, such as is currently being undertaken by the European Union on mandatory due diligence. For NCPs, again, it is key to apply the MNE guidelines in a consistent manner, and this is only possible if a good knowledge of the standards that the guidelines refer to is there. Of course, we can also achieve coherence on the ground, and Madeleine already mentioned the two very important projects in Latin America and Asia, where together with the ILO, the European Union, the OECD contributed to support in-country policy developments, and again with a very strong focus on labor rights. And since this year is the year of elimination of child labor, I would also like to mention another important piece of work that the OECD and the ILO, together with UNICEF, have done together. That's under the Alliance 8.7 project. So it's a clear indication of putting synergies to work. So I'm really convinced that this training for NCPs, which the European Union and the ILO so generously offer, contributes to coherence because it does focus on better knowledge and the common understanding of the ILO instruments referred to in the OECD guidelines. If NCPs know how they can contribute to a good implementation of the OECD guidelines by making good use of the ILO MNE declaration and work together with the ILO on the ground, I think then RBC will take a great step forward. And I would like to thank again the ILO and the European Union for offering this fantastic opportunity. And now I'm really eager then to hear from you and also learn from your experiences and see how we can put these synergies to work and improve the life of the people we all care so much about. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christine, for these remarks and already for these very concrete perspectives on the need and the usefulness of collaboration and working together and of organizing these events. Last but not least, before our virtual coffee break, I would like to hand over now to Gita Roelants from the ILO. Gita.
Yes, thank you very much, Carl, and thank you very much, Madeleine and Christine, for these really motivating, I would say, words of introduction to our training, and already clearly highlighting how we are working together. I think that is really fantastic, and the importance of us working together. And I really want to start by thanking Madeleine and her team for making this training possible, because it's thanks to the joint project, of course, that we have on Trade for Decent Work, that we can indeed offer this joint training and bring the OECD and the NCPs together for this training on labor standards. Because as it was pointed out by Christine, I think it is labor standards, labor issues, challenges in business operations are a very important component of what NCPs are doing. And it is therefore important to know about the ILO and the ILO standards, because they are indeed confronted with those, or can use those in their own operations. So I don't want to be too long in the introduction, because I will have another session with you on Wednesday, and then throughout the training I will be engaging with you. But I do want to just make a few introductory remarks. And so I'm the head of the ILO Multinational Enterprises Unit, which is part of the Enterprises Department in the ILO. And I think that is already quite interesting to see how we are really embedded in the Enterprises Department, which overall, the mandate of that department is the promotion of sustainable enterprises. And when we talk about sustainable enterprises, I mean, we were talking already about resilience. Of course, we are talking about responsible. So when we talk about sustainable enterprises, it's really what we do is promote, I would say, the three elements of enterprises, which is, of course, economically viable, environmentally friendly, and socially responsible. That is what the ILO stands for in the promotion of sustainable enterprises. And the way that we do this is obviously through, at the one hand, working with governments on putting in place the legislative framework, through social dialogue, as was already pointed out by Madeleine and Christine, and then also working directly with enterprises on expectations in respect of their contribution to decent work and inclusive economic growth. Our work of the unit and on the promotion of the M&E Declaration, where the lead unit for the promotion of the M&E Declaration, our work is directly guided by the ILO governing body, and that was already mentioned also by a number of the participants. So I'm very pleased that we have a number of participants that also go to the ILO, the International Labour Conference, or participate in the ILO governing body, because of course you already understand how the tripartite structure in the ILO works. So everything we do in relation to the promotion of the M&E Declaration is guided by governments, employers, and workers. And it really looks at how, through the promotion of these sustainable enterprises, the M&E Declaration, this contributes to the broader decent work agenda. And as such, of course, contributes to also the even bigger picture that is there in the United Nations, which of course is the promotion of the sustainable, or not the promotion, the achieving, making progress on the sustainable development goals. And that is really the longer, I think the longer aim that we also should not forget. And Christine already mentioned this year is, for example, the International Year on the Elimination of Child Labor. it is directly linked to, of course, Sustainable Development Goal and Target 8.7, on which we have this global alliance for the elimination of child labor. Child labor is included, of course, in now also trade agreements specifically. So in a way, it's how a lot of these elements come together. And I think you will see that during the course. We will be, of course, referencing to, at the one hand, what the ILO does in terms of its conventions, recommendations, working with governments, social partners on ratifying these conventions, implementing or applying them in law and practice, the ILO supervisory mechanism, and then, of course, how this is complemented with our work directly with enterprises on responsible business. As Madeleine mentioned, this is the second time we are organizing this training, and unfortunately, I must say really unfortunately, we are not together on the campus in Turin, because I think, you know, just, and I want to say thank you for that also for Carl and his team, because of course we are now moving totally in this virtual setting where we try to give as much as possible the feeling of being part of, you know, a group of participants, offering possibilities through the e-platform of engaging. But of course, nothing can really replace a face-to-face training, although we are doing our best. I think next time, and hopefully we will be able to organize the next time, we hope it will be again back in Turin on our campus, so that we can all come together. At the other hand, I must say, of course, you know, having a training in a virtual way also allows for participants from around the world to participate. And that is, I think, really also the added value of this second training, that it is not limited to the NCPs of OECD or EU member states, let's say, but this time that we really had the privilege of being able to invite OECD's, the NCPs of all of the OECD member states. And I think the good reaction we received also from these NCPs is really very encouraging. And I think the exchanges indeed between the different NCPs will clearly enrich this session of the training, this edition of the training. We have a very good and a very diverse group of participants, and I think that will also add really to the rich character of this training. Because on the slide, as Carol showed the slide, we have, I would say, of course, colleagues who work directly in the NCP Secretariat, but of course also others coming from ministries, but also from employers' organizations. And if I'm not mistaken, we also have from workers' organizations. So, you know, we are talking about social dialogue, and Christine already highlighted the importance of social dialogue. In a way, this kind of training offers also possibilities for social dialogue, as we have broadened, in a way, the group of participants. All of these countries, of course, are not only members of the OECD or adhering to the OECD M&E guidelines, but they're also all ILO member states. And as I mentioned, a number of you, of course, participate in ILO governance structures, in ILO programs, but many of you may not be so familiar with the ILO. And so this is really a course where you will get a really good sense of how the ILO operates, what our standards look like, and the specific topics we are working on, and which we have in the pipeline also dealing for the future. So in looking at the objectives of the course, increased knowledge of ILO standards, instruments, and tools related to RBC. As Carl said, it's in the first week we will be looking at that, and already it starts this afternoon with my colleague Emily Sims, the manager of the ILO Help Desk for Business, doing that introduction. So you will be hearing a lot of how we work with governments and social partners, and how this is complemented by our work on responsible business conduct, through the promotion of the M&E declaration at the global and the country level, and of course in partnership with the other international organizations like the OECD, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the EU, but also UNDP, the UN Global Compact, because all of these other organizations in their own instruments, of course, reference back to ILO standards, be it the ILO Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work or the ILO M&E Declaration. And so you will hear about these tools, the ILO Help Desk for Business, our country level assistance, including development cooperation projects as the ones, of course, we have with the EU, but also funded by the US, by Canada. We have many of our member states funding and being partners in development cooperation projects. But also promotion through national focal points for the promotion of the M&E declaration and company union dialogue facilitation. So you will hear a lot about all of these different tools. The objective of developing a community of practice on responsible business conduct goes very much in the sense, I would say, of what Christine is also mentioning about the importance of coherence. Because what we really want to give to business is, of course, coherent guidance in line with these three international instruments that were mentioned by Christine, and that, of course, are also included in EU trade agreements, which are the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, the ILO M&E Declaration, and the OECD M&E Guidelines. For that, we have developed brochures, we have developed joint tools already. There is an alignment brochure that was developed as part of our projects on how these three instruments in a way are aligned, consistent in their approaches, but also in the due diligence guidance that was developed by the OECD, but where also the ILO participated in the advisory groups developing precisely this guidance to ensure that there is alignment and coherence in the guidance that is provided. And of course, that is important because then afterwards governments, when they start putting in place their due diligence legislation, and I think a number of the participants from today already come from countries that have legally binding or mandatory due diligence requirements, whether it's in specific areas like child labor or forced labor or more generally. Of course, this goes back to the international standards. And so that is very important in relation to the coherence element. The opportunities for collaboration and synergies, I think that will be an important element of the third week of our work. And in that regard, I already mentioned some of the tools. Of course, we have our projects in Asia, Latin America, where we are working together with the OECD, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and the European Union, but also inviting some other UN agencies in some of the activities. These are already clear ways in which we are moving towards more synergies and coherence in the implementation of these international instruments. And in that regard, I must say I'm also very pleased to have among the participants 2 countries that not only have NCPs for RBC under the OECD M&E guidelines, but that also have national focal points for the promotion of the M&E declaration. That is, of course, Norway. And I hope at a certain moment we will hear more about how the Norwegian NCP is actually promoting both instruments and what this actually means in practice. But the other country is Portugal, where at the one hand you have the NCP, and then you have the national focal point for the promotion of the M&E declaration in the Ministry of Labor, and then to see how these could better work together. So I think that is really very encouraging, because when we look at now more and more countries at the one hand have national action plans on business and human rights, there are NCPs for RBC, there are the ILO offices which were mentioned, but of course also national focal points, development cooperation projects, and how these in a way can all work more together to really bring about change at the country level. And that is something that I really would like to put forward. I mean, in the end of the day, we are all here to increase opportunities for, I mean, when we look again at the ILO's agenda, but even, I mean, when I look at the OECD now, I think, Christine, it's better lives. Sorry, I forget again the slogan of the OECD, but I think it's better policies for better lives, if I don't, if I remember correctly. I mean, for the ILO, of course, it's decent work, taking a humor-centered approach to the future of work. So you have the SDGs. So in the end, what we are all looking for is, of course, I would say, more inclusive economic growth in the context of our globalized world. And we are all contributing to that, or you all try to contribute to that and provide support there where it is really needed. Of course, it's at the country level, and when we think about due diligence and when we think about supply chains, we know where the changes really need to happen. So in a way, it's really how we can really about, you know, bringing our different instruments, our implementation mechanisms, bringing them together and give support also to the companies that are doing their due diligence, engaging with their business partners in the countries where things need to change to bring about this change. So I don't want to say anything more, except that, of course, yes, COVID and the impact of COVID on the world of work has already been mentioned. And in that regard, our Director General always keeps on saying, you know, it's about building back better. We need to go for a better normal. It's not just going back to, you know, what we had before. It is really looking at the opportunities that also are being provided by the current crisis to think about the role of business in society and to really do something about the existing inequalities that already existed in many of our economies and societies, and see this crisis as an opportunity to move towards more sustainable and resilient and responsible enterprises. And I think that is really the focus of this course, is how we can increase collaboration to achieve that. So with this, I wish us all a really, really interesting and stimulating course. It was said before, you are here to learn, but we are also to learn there from you, so that we also, in the tools we further develop, projects we may have, we know better how to also respond to your needs and how we can better work together. So for all of us, I wish us a really, really good course. Over to you, Carl.
Yes, I was unmuting here. Okay, thank you, Gita. Thank you also, Madeleine and Christine, for these opening remarks. I think a lot of issues were touched upon. Responsible business conduct, not only as a condition for sustainability, but also for resilience, especially in the light of the crisis, the COVID crisis that we are still facing. The importance or the prominence of labor issues when we are discussing responsible business is something which also was observed by Christina, and also coherence not only on paper or in words, but also coherence at the level of implementation. There are still opportunities, and then Gita building back better, the role of responsible business and the recovery from the crisis, where there also are opportunities emerging that could lead to more and better collaboration in the terms of responsible business. As said, Gita will still be with us on Wednesday and throughout the course, observing the sessions, but specifically on Wednesday, we will go deeper into the aim and the objective of the M&E declaration. And I would like to conclude here now the first part of this webinar. Madeleine and Christina and Gita, thank you once again for making yourself available. And I would like to say to the participants, let's take a 10-minute break. Let's go outside, take some fresh air. I hope it's not raining. Let's take some fresh air, stretch your legs, and then we will be returning and 3:25, if this is fine for you. So we will be back here, back at 15:25. At least the time here in Turin. I'm not sure what time it is in Australia or in Costa Rica, but take a 10-minute break and we see each other then for the session with Emily on the ILO and the normative instruments. Thank you very much, and we see each other in 10 minutes. Then we are ready to start in a few minutes.
Can you see?
Yes, perfect.
And video?
Yes.
Got to have the video.
I want to repeat that. Feel free to ask questions in the Zoom chat box.
Yeah, and I'm going to be asking them questions that they're going to be typing in the chat
if
box.
not,
so
we
I'll have to
ask
open
you
it up for
questions. So no, please do it. Don't be shy. Ask questions or comments. It's always good. It's always for us also, if we are presenting, it's a good moment to breathe. So okay, good, Emily. I would say go ahead.
Okay, great. Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be here with you today. I hope for those of you who are on the very early side or the late side, I'm going to try and keep it lively so that you're not nodding off. And hopefully we'll have an enjoyable discussion. As you'll see along the way, I ask take polls, have little quizzes, because I much prefer to have a conversation with you than to lecture. Although I confess we have a lot of material to get through in a short period of time, so I will be a little bit in lecture mode, but feel free to ask questions in the chat box, or if there's something burning, you can raise your hand or whatever you do, and Carl will interrupt me and to be able to ask the question. I have no problems with that. So with that, let's get started. So I've been asked to talk to you about international labor standards. And I'm going to be going over today with you where they come from, what they are, why people use them, and what resources are available to you as NCPs and people engaging with NCPs that can maybe help you in your work. So let's get started. So it won't surprise you to know that the international labor standards come from the International Labor Organization. So for those of you who are not familiar with the ILO, it was founded in 1919 as part of the Treaty of Versailles. And if you want to Google it, it's Article 23, I believe. It's a specialized agency of the United Nations, which means we have our own membership, our own income structure, and governance structures and so forth, but we coordinate extremely closely with the United Nations, and with the UN, we are part of the One UN delivery system. So we work very closely together. We have 187 member states. So that's not quite everyone, but that's almost, I think there are 195 countries, if I'm not mistaken. So we're almost universal. So the standards truly are universal. And when I talk about later on the development of standards, you'll see how input from all of these countries comes about. And last but not least, our mission is to promote social justice through our decent work agenda, and that is composed of 4 pillars, including realizing rights at work, promoting employment, enhancing social protection, and strengthening social dialogue. So I'm a big history buff. So I like pictures, I like quotes from old texts and so forth. So I thought I would share with you the very first International Labor Conference, especially, I think it was our colleague from Norway who was talking about participating in the labor conference. Well, these were your predecessors. It's not a very diverse group. Even the lone woman, she's unfortunately not a delegate. She's an assistant to the secretary who is responsible for providing services to the entire delegation. But even though they're not a very diverse group, they are our first conference, and we have since diversified a great deal. But let's talk about what they might have been talking about in 1990. So at this Paris conference, the first conference was in Paris, not Geneva, they adopted 6 conventions concerning 5 labor issues. What would you guess were the 5 issues? If you could just type in your chat box. So I have child labor, working hours, forced labor, migrant workers, adequate pay. Okay, those are good guesses. Annual working conditions, okay. Unemployment, gender, working hours. Okay, let's take a look. So the first convention adopted was on hours of work in industry that I think at least one, if not a couple of you guessed. Unemployment was certainly a very big issue. Maternity protection. So gender equality, not fully, but maternity protection is a really important first start. And given it's about 25 elder men, it's actually pretty progressive for them, I would say. Night work by women and young people, and the minimum age for work in industry. Some of these issues we've made a lot of progress on. Others, you'll probably notice they're still quite important and lingering issues. Even the earliest of our conventions have not become irrelevant quite yet. So why do we have international labor standards? Well, one of the important reasons is to improve the living conditions and living and working conditions of workers. But another important reason that was touched on by Gita in her opening comments, and also with the other opening speakers to some extent, is the promotion of growth in enterprises and economic development. You cannot get to workers' rights if you don't have employment, and you don't have employment if you don't have strong and growing enterprises and economic development to be able to absorb workers into the formal economy. It's also about equalizing conditions for international competition so that countries that are trying to do more to protect their workers are not undercut in international markets by competitors. And to consolidate social peace. Remember, the ILO was set up in the Treaty of Versailles, and this is the exact article. It says, subject to and in accordance with the provisions of international conventions existing or hereinafter to be agreed upon, the members of the League, it's referring to the League of Nations that's set up as part of the Treaty of Versailles, will endeavor to secure and maintain fair and humane conditions of labor for men and women, which is that first bullet, and children, both in their own countries and in all countries in which their commercial and industrial relations extend. And for this purpose will establish and maintain the necessary international organization. So the consolidation of peace is the backdrop of the whole instrument in which it's being set up. But trade and international competition were from the very beginning, echoing, or Marilyn was echoing what they were thinking of at that time, that it's really important for the whole system to be durable and fair to everyone involved. So what are the features of international labor standards? Well, they're universal. Remember, it's 187 member states. So almost every country involved that exists is involved in developing labor standards. And each of those member states, as you may know, consists not only of a government representative, but of an employer's representative and a worker's representative. So it's truly tripartite. And the concerns of workers, who are not the exclusive, but the main beneficiaries of international labor standards, are right there to be able to speak about what they need for their rights to be realized. But also the employers, who are the ones that are on the front line having to implement the labor standards as they are then incorporated into national law and then actually operationalized in companies. They're right there also talking about what they need to be able to actually achieve the objectives set out in the international labor standards. So it has already built into them quite an important balance between protection of workers' rights and broader economic development objectives, the role of the state in protecting them, and in the role of businesses that are expected to respect them and what they need to be able to continue to be viable operations. It's important to also remember that international labor standards are setting minimum standards. That's because we want everyone to be able to achieve them. So it's not finding the least common denominator, but finding the realistic stretch that doesn't leave out countries, with the understanding, and not only understanding, but active encouragement for countries to go further. Because what happens over time is that conventions like the first 6 we talked about, they get superseded by more recent conventions that are capturing the progress that has been made and the ability to move up that minimum standard to the next level. And from there to the next level after that. So for instance, in maternity, there are now 3 conventions, 83 and 103. They all have a 3 in them for some reason, but all 3 exist side by side, but they are moving up the benchmark, each one as we go along, so that we don't lose any countries, but we're still encouraging countries to go further. But it's important to remember that labor standards very rarely contain in them something that a country cannot do, or by extension, a company cannot do that goes beyond the principles set in the labor standards, because they're setting floors, not ceilings. And they are flexible. The international labor standards recognize that there are very different juridical systems around the world. As one example, the difference between common law systems and civil law systems. There are also very different industrial relations systems, very different ways governments manage labor markets. So you cannot have a very narrow, prescriptive, one-size-fits-all approach. So labor standards are not setting out detailed blueprints. They're setting out overall objectives and key things that governments must bear in mind to be able to achieve those objectives without creating collateral damage. But beyond that, the how is really left at the level of the national level, where the government should be further discussing with the national employers and workers organizations to find the right mechanisms and balance to be able to achieve the principles in a constructive way that adds value to everyone concerned in the country. So what types of international labor standards are there? Well, there's 2 types. There are conventions. Conventions are international multilateral treaties that are open to ratification by any member states. You have to be a member state because you're subject to then the follow-up mechanisms, and a non-member wouldn't be able to do that. But I don't think anyone non-member is ever asked anyway to ratify a convention. But the states must put newly adopted conventions before the appropriate body for consideration. That is to say that even if a country isn't particularly interested in ratifying a newly adopted convention, it has to go before usually it's their parliament, it could be another body, but usually it's the parliament itself, and it's discussed. It doesn't have to be ratified, but it has to be discussed, because the idea is the public must be made aware of it and given the opportunity to speak up about whether it would want to ratify it or not. And once a convention is ratified, it's legally binding, and the state is subject to requirements to report on a periodic basis, not only about the law that is adopted to give effect to the convention in the national context, but also the practice, which is very important, because there are many, many countries where I used to work in the standards department that was responsible for reviewing in the first instance these reports to prepare for the committee of experts. And there are many, many cases where governments would ratify everything and actually apply nothing. So seeing both the law, but also the practice, the data that shows that the law is actually being implemented effectively, are both important reporting requirements. There's another set of instruments in international labor standards called recommendations. Recommendations are different than conventions. They are simply guidance. They are not open for ratification. But what they are, they come in two forms. One is a supplement to a convention. So very commonly you'll have a convention and a recommendation adopted at the same time. And the recommendation is either kind of further elaborating on the provisions in the convention, or sometimes including extra provisions that there wasn't quite agreement that that was fair to ask as a floor. Remember, I was talking about standards setting a floor, that some, enough voting members decided, well, that's a good idea, but it's too much for a floor right now. So we'll put it in the recommendation to inspire, but it's not enough. It's not at the level of the floor quite yet. But there are also autonomous recommendations that cover a subject for which there is no convention. So an example of that is the older workers recommendation, which talks about how older workers who are trying to get back into the employment, what special considerations government policies should bear in mind, or older workers transitioning out of the labor force, what sorts of policies should be put in place to support them. That's just one example of a recommendation. There's a third type of instrument, and these are protocols. What protocols are doing is they are adding onto an existing convention. They never delete or take away, but they may add something to an existing convention. But the thing is, they are separate than the original convention. So here's the original convention, here's the protocol that supplements it. You can ratify the convention, but not necessarily ratify the protocol. So an example of that is the protocol to Convention 29 on forced labor. This was adopted in light of the UN Guiding Principles. What was lacking from our instruments on forced labor was a clear articulated right of victims of forced labor to a remedy. So that's what the protocol is doing. And so a lot of countries have ratified Convention 29, but there's really still only a handful of countries, I think maybe it's 10 or 12, that have ratified the protocol. Perhaps others will follow. They don't have to, but that's the way protocols work. So another little quiz for you. Do you have a question?
Yes, I mean, there are just two questions. I think the first question was from Pablo. I think, Pablo, do I understand your question correctly? Like, how are recommendations developed, I suppose, is the question. Because you asked how are they delivered, is that correct? Or how they are developed? How is recommendation developed, I think is the question.
I'll explain a little bit about how the whole process of standards are developed in a little bit. And it's the exact same process. It's called a standard setting process, and it's identical whether it's a convention, a recommendation, or both. And that's actually where the decision is made, whether to go down one path, the other, or both paths simultaneously is in the standard setting process.
Then I had another question by John, and I think next week, in any case, this will be the topic, but how come that the ILO is involved in certain topics, such as in this case, indigenous peoples? Why is it suddenly the ILO that is on the forefront for this particular group?
Well, anything that relates to the world of work, and if you look at our conventions, there are two instruments concerning indigenous people, 107 and 169. And the reason we originally became involved in the work of in the rights of indigenous people was there was nothing else out there. As you may know, the UN DRIP, I think it links back to 2014 or 2012. I'm getting my dates mixed up, but there was nothing. And there are indigenous people who are workers, and they're part of the world of work as well. But their particular situation, for the most part, isn't adequately covered by traditional conventions or recommendations. We also have, for instance, conventions just dealing with the world of work for seafarers, which, because of their very peculiar nature of their work, does not fit with just broader instruments on, say, leave time or hours of work, for example. So they have their own set of instruments recognizing the particular nature. But our mandate is the world of work, and we're pretty good to stick to that. The thing, though, is it's not always clear where the lines are drawn. So there is overlap. So, for instance, we have an instrument on moving from the informal to the formal economy, which enterprises that are not operating legally, to get them to operate legally within the legal framework. So you could argue, well, isn't that more like UNIDO or, I don't know, UNCTAD or something? But because they are so critical, enterprise development is so critical to job creation, which is so critical to workers' rights, it's not easy to just say, no, sorry, we're not going to deal with that issue. Because if you look at a lot of root causes of a lot of the issues we deal with, it often links back to informal economy actors and having a split economy, basically. So we, as I said, we try and be disciplined, and we're pretty good about that. On the other hand, we're also one of the only standard setting organizations in the world. There are some, the UN has some treaties, and you have, like, for instance, the World Maritime Organization, or WIPO, which is for intellectual property. But for the most part, we're the only ones that set standards. So to the extent also that even if we overlap with another organization, but they're not a standard setting organization, and our members feel it would be useful to have such a standard, then we go ahead and develop it. But remember, when I say we, I'm not talking about the office that I work for. I'm talking about the organization, which is all 887 member states. Any other questions at this juncture, Carl, that you think we should address?
Well, I don't have any. These were the two ones that were mentioned in the chat, but of course, maybe if somebody has another specific question, please go ahead.
Well, let's do another pop quiz then.
Exactly.
So what are the fundamental, you don't have to mention the conventions themselves, that might be a little too in the weeds, but does anyone know what the 4 areas, the 4 topics covered by the fundamental conventions? Have you ever heard of the phrase fundamental principles and rights at work, or fundamental conventions? Anyone know? Anyone want to guess what the topics are? Child labor, collective bargaining, forced labor, someone's doing their homework. Freedom of association, and discrimination. Okay, you guys have covered all of them. Great, excellent. So here they are. And these are the associated convention numbers. So these are called the fundamental principles and rights at work, or the fundamental conventions that are setting out the fundamental principles and rights at work, for a very particular reason. These are rights that are not just rights in themselves, but they are enabling rights, which means that they're a precursor for being able to realize other rights. So for instance, if you're in forced labor, you probably do not ever get to the issue of whether you're being paid an adequate wage. If you are a victim of discrimination and precluded from work altogether, then issues like safety and health, or whether your pension is adequate to cover you in your old age, again, you don't get to that issue. Or even if you're able to get into work, but you're not paid the same as your colleagues because of non-discrimination, it's a different issue about wages, not the same issue facing your the workers in your organization as a whole. Child labor, it's the same idea. If you are a young person who's denied an adequate education and the opportunity to either go on to vocational education or post-secondary education, you are being denied the right to develop your capacity to improve your earnings, to be able to support yourself and your family better, to lift yourselves out of poverty and help lift your community out of poverty. And the cycles of poverty continue. And freedom of association and collective bargaining are bedrock principles and rights, because that is the main mechanism for achieving all the other rights in a way that balances both the rights of the workers and the interests and the sustainability of the company when they sit down together and talk about expectations and objectives and constraints and how to fit those all together the best way possible. That is the best way to protect workers' rights. So that's why these four categories, because some people say, but where is safety and health? And I myself think, oh my gosh, why isn't safety and health in there? Because surely the right to life is pretty darn fundamental. But in this case, fundamental is talking about enabling rights that support the whole range of other rights. So hopefully that makes sense to you all. But these are the ones that you'll bump up against the most often. They'll show up in the IFC performance standards, or Equator principles, or stock exchanges will often list these, or procurement calls for tenders in procurement processes of the government will often list the fundamental principles and rights at work as the key social compliance criteria. So it's really important to be very familiar with these, because these tend to be the ones that are most often focused on. But there are other ones that are also really important because they are dealing with the underlying systems that ensure protection of workers' rights. So those include these top two here, which are labor inspection and labor inspection in agriculture. Going back to what I said before, if you don't actually enforce the law on your books, it is worth pretty much nothing. So having good labor inspection is really important to actually protecting workers' rights. So these are considered priority conventions because the committee of experts needs to verify that the government is not just taking seriously implementing conventions in law, but in practice. And convention number 122 on employment policy, it goes back to what I said before. If you don't have a job in the formal sector, you don't have any rights. You just have hopes and prayers because no one knows you're there. The government doesn't know you exist, and you don't have any rights. So having a solid employment policy is really important for protecting workers' rights. But also, there is a very important motivation for effective employment policy, because the more you have a few workers fighting to get the few jobs in the formal sector, the more downward pressure that puts on even those who are lucky enough to work in the formal sector. So it's not just the trying to help those who are outside the formal sector to be able to get employment to secure their rights, but also to alleviate the downward pressure and to help companies to grow. And the last but not least is the Convention on Tripartite Consultations. This is referring to consultations at the national level. So how the government is consulting with the employers and workers on labor legislation, on various policies like vocational education and training, or macroeconomic policies to stimulate employment, et cetera, that can be very important to get the inputs of the employers and workers who are affected by that law and policy. And so this is a priority convention because it's such a strong founding principle of the ILO that those sorts of decisions really should be made in consultation and not unilaterally by the government alone. So the fundamental conventions and the priority conventions, the governments need to report on them every 2 years. For all other conventions, it's every 5 years to explain to the committee of experts or other supervisory bodies as relevant what is going on with the state of their law and implementation. So back to my quizzes. We've covered a few of the topics that are addressed in international labor standards. What would you guess are some of the other topics? If you can type them again in the chat box. Okay. Indigenous and seafarers, yes. OSH, yes. Social Security, equal pay between men and women, sustainability, sort of. I'll explain that a bit more. Working hours, overtime, I guess. Mining working conditions. Domestic workers. Okay. We have guidelines on mining. We don't have a specific convention on mining or recommendation, but we do have sector-specific guidance that's tripartite developed. And violence at work. Yes, that's one of our most recent ones. Violence and harassment. You're right, the whole phrase is violence and harassment at work. Equality, sexual exploitation. We have some guidelines on that, but the only element about sexual exploitation is folded into the violence and harassment at work. Maritime workers is one of the biggest blocks of conventions and recommendations, especially if you throw in the ones that relate to fishing as well. It's a huge block of our conventions. Migration, homework. Well, so you guys, either you guys are all on the internet right now, or you know your labor standards very well. Wages, yes. Temporary work, yes. Actually, we have one specifically devoted to temporary placement agencies and the guidelines for the respective workers' rights. Great. So you guys are really on the job. So let's see. Here is the whole range: vocational guidance and training, employment security, wages, occupational safety and health, violence and harassment at work, social security, maternity protection, social policy. Social policy, I should explain, is at a bigger level. It's an older convention that relates, it used to refer really just to colonies and how governments treated their colonies. Remember, we're an old institution, and the abolition of colonies only took place after the Second World War. But even now, it's gotten a bit of a renaissance because social policy has been flagging for quite a while in a lot of countries, and it's making, there's a revival. Migrant workers, indigenous and tribal peoples, HIV/AIDS in the workplace, and then all sorts of specific categories of workers: seafarers, dock workers, office workers, plantation workers, hotel workers, domestic workers, etc. So there's no guarantee that we have a convention or recommendation for everything, but we're likely to have it for quite a few things that you may be dealing with. But even if we don't have that, as someone had asked for one of the issues, mining, we also have a whole bunch of tripartite negotiated instruments that are specific to sectors. And the reason those are not conventions or recommendations is that for the most part, we try and make these universal. But then we don't want to have such incredible fragmentation across all sorts of issues. What we do instead is have these tripartite expert meetings where they develop codes of practice that are supplementing what might be missing from a convention, the conventions or recommendations, and put those in our sectoral guidance. So we can help you with that if you have a sector specific question. Okay, so another quiz. What is the most widely ratified ILO convention? Is it the Convention on Freedom of Association and Protection of the Right to Organize, on forced labor, or on the worst forms of child labor? You want to type in the chat box what you think it is? So I see number three, okay. Yeah. Okay, 182, 87, 29. So we got different opinions, and certainly they're all widely ratified. But there's only one that is universally ratified, and that's Convention 182, and that was only in 2019. I think Togo was the last country to ratify, but that is the one convention amongst all of our conventions that has been ratified by every member state of the ILO. So yay for Convention 182. Okay, a couple of people mentioned gender equality before, and so I just want to explain a little bit how gender equality features in conventions recommendations, because it's really, really important. So first of all, we have instruments that are just focused on gender equality or equality more generally, but specifically including prohibitions on sex discrimination. So we have the Equal Remuneration Convention, which, as someone mentioned in the chat box, is focused just on equal pay for men and women for work of equal value and closing the gender pay gap. There's also the Convention on Discrimination that covers 7 areas, but one of them is prohibiting discrimination based on sex. We have also a Convention on Workers with Family Responsibilities, so that men and women who have either children or older family members or someone who needs them are able to try and balance their work and life responsibilities more easily. And then there's the Violence and Harassment Convention of 2019. So those are ones that are very specifically gender-based, either principally or some of them exclusively. But then there are other relevant instruments that are, some of them by the nature of the issue itself, like maternity protection. It's primarily about women, although our 2000 update recognizes the right of paternity leave as well. So it's not exclusively about the rights of women workers who may be of childbearing age. And then there's, for instance, the Domestic Workers Convention, which has a little section in it that talks about recognizing that there are both men and women who are domestic workers, but the particular vulnerabilities of women domestic workers who make up the vast majority of domestic workers. But beyond that, what we do as an exercise, both in developing drafts of an instrument, but also in in the process of developing it itself, and even going back once it's adopted and checking for coherence, we make sure that it is consistent with all the other instruments, but also that it is consistent, it has adequately taken up consideration of how a particular issue affects women workers, and also, or men in certain cases, like domestic workers, the majority are men, but there are issues that concern, or women, but there are issues that concern men domestic workers. But also how the way it's structured may have unintended gendered impacts. So we try and gender mainstream across all the issues, not just have a few conventions or recommendations that have a sort of explicit focus on gender. Because that is one of our very, very top priorities at the ILO is gender equality. Okay, so how are ILO instruments supervised? I don't think I've explained, I think it's later I explain. Let me just explain briefly, and if I have a slide later, well, it's okay, I can't remember. The way that international labor standards are developed is that we as an, first of all, we as an office are responsible for kind of keeping track of trends and issues that seem to arise, either positive issues or positive trends or negative trends. And then we produce background papers and studies. And then to the extent that they resonate with our constituents, or our constituents bring the issues to our attention themselves, then they are possibly put on the agenda for consideration whether we should have a general discussion about this particular issue, whatever it might be, issue X. So if they make it to a general discussion, during the general discussion, they might just adopt a set of conclusions, they meaning the International Labor Conference. All international labor standards and recommendations are only adopted by the International Labor Conference, which means the plenary of the entire 187 member states. So if they decide in the general discussion, yeah, this is important, we need actually an instrument. It's not enough to have a general set of conclusions that gives general guidance. We want either a convention or a recommendation or maybe both. So then they put it back on the agenda. And in the interim, what the office does is we do our homework. We investigate, well, what goes on at the national level around the world? What are key trends? We also survey. We actually send out surveys and ask countries, can you tell us about your legislation and your practice? And then we consolidate all of that information to a report. And that report is the basis of a first discussion at the conference, a standard setting discussion. And then the conference itself decides, okay, well, yeah, maybe they could say, well, maybe we're wrong. Everything looks good. We don't need an instrument. So then they stop and it just stops after the first round. Or they say, well, clearly there is a need for us to do something. So let's have a second discussion the next year at the conference that puts us back on the agenda to either try to hammer out either a convention or a recommendation, or at least try to. So then office goes back at work, and we, based on the first report we prepared and the inputs and reactions from the conference, we try and prepare a draft. It's sort of like a skeletal, what an instrument might look like. We send that out to all 187 member states again, and they get to write comments all over it and say, no, we don't like this. This is not realistic. Oh, this is really important. We should have 5 articles on this point alone, whatever they think. And then we consolidate all of that input, and that goes to the conference for the second discussion. And from there, they have a general discussion, and then they go into drafting mode, because we're just sketching in extremely broad brush terms what they might want to consider, but it's a drafting group that actually sits down and creates the draft that they want, either a convention, recommendation, or both. And then it finally gets fine-tuned, and either it passes, which means that 2/3, not 50%, but 2/3 have voted in favor of the instrument, or it fails. And it could be either a convention, a recommendation, or both. Now, when I say they, and when I say the surveys have gone out to all 187 member states and they've made comments, all 187 member states, remember, I'm talking about 3 groups in each national they, the government, the employers, and the workers. So we have almost 600 different viewpoints that are going into developing any particular instrument. So that's the sort of very exciting but extremely labor-intensive birthing process of how an instrument is developed. But it's very much worthwhile. But all of that is to say that there is an enormous amount of consensus and compromise going into it. So conventions and recommendations are not easy instruments to read. You know, the saying that a camel is a horse drawn by a committee. Well, our instruments are you know, documents written up by 600 different people holding pens or 600 different bodies holding the pen. So they are like, you know, a camel with 19 humps instead of just one. So I apologize in advance if you're trying to struggle reading some of these instruments, but they're very worthwhile. So do you have a question, Carl, or are you?
Yeah, on behalf of, maybe John, you can ask the question, to be sure, John?
Thanks, sorry, I'll just turn my video on. You just were saying either a convention or recommendation or both. And I guess I'm interested why sometimes both and why sometimes one or another.
Yes, well, it could be because, remember, we're setting floors, and we're also, it's up to it's by we, in this case, I'm talking again about the International Labor Conference. So it's up to them to decide, well, this is something that we really think should go into a convention because it's a reasonable ask of everyone. Everyone is likely to be able to reach this minimum. And we think it's an appropriate thing that should be in a convention because governments can ratify it and then bind themselves. You know, you may be wondering, well, why would a government ever want to bind itself to one of these conventions? But it's because it gives them a motivation and also a justification for then going to their counterparts in other ministries and explaining why, for the sake of policy coherence, we need to do, say, investment promotion in a slightly different way, or that you have, you know, in thinking of industrial policy, you need to also consider the quality of the jobs being created or something like that. So that's why it's got either convention or recommendation or both, as I had mentioned before. Okay, I think the thumbs up means I can move on. Yeah. Okay. So how international labor standards are supervised. So we have here two approaches. One is regular supervision, which means, remember I was talking about reporting cycles every 2 years, every 5 years. That's regular supervision. And then there is the special procedures that arise out of complaints. So for this regular supervision in the first step, all those reports that governments are sending back in, explaining what legislation they put in place or what the data shows about the effectiveness in practice, they're going to the committee of experts. There's an office in between that because there's too many files for them to digest in a short, because they sit for, I think, 2.5 weeks. They are not ILO officials. They are independent experts. They're primarily lawyers. They're all lawyers, but they're primarily justices or law academics. And they're asking a very technical question. As a matter of law, has the government given sufficient effect to the convention, and what areas is it doing well in, and what areas could it do better in? And it's like a dialogue. They're conversing. The government is telling the committee what it's done, and the committee is saying, oh, it's giving feedback. Oh, good job here. Here we see there are problems, and this is where we would like to see you bring your practice more into line with the convention. They produce a report that then goes to the Conference Committee on the Application of Standards. This is a political process, not a technical process. They read the committees of experts report, and then they start to discuss what they think are the implications. They're not negating the findings of the committee of experts, but they may be elaborating a little bit more, say, around why they think there are certain problems. I should say the committee of experts, they have two parts. One part is about individual countries' reports on their ratified conventions. And the other part is general trends that they observe, looking across all of the reports and perhaps over years for a particular topic, because it's part of their job to alert the ILO, the conference, to important trends that they need to pay attention to. So the conference committee is discussing those trends, and then they also maybe discuss a handful of cases. Some of those cases each year are chosen because they're good and they want to draw attention to good trends and to encourage and inspire other governments. But most of the cases discussed are problematic, where the dialogue between the committee of experts and the government has persisted, maybe even gotten worse. And they want to, as a political statement of the ILO, say, really, this is an important issue. And it may be that the government all agrees, well, okay, will them publicly commit to do something to improve it, or they may agree to a committee of inquiry, to have a tripartite delegation come and observe the facts on the ground if there's a strong disagreement about how they're giving effect and so forth to the particular convention. So those are the regular supervisory machinery. Then there are special procedures. There's ones based on constitutional provisions. These are Article 24 or Article 26 of the Constitution. Article 24 are representations. That means that the employers or workers of a country that has ratified a particular convention, they have a right to bring a complaint saying, hey, our country, our government is not living up to their commitments under this convention. And we want the committee of experts, those complaints go to the committee of experts. Saying that they're not living up to their commitments, and that will provoke, because the committee of experts invites the government to respond and explain itself. Complaints are very similar, but the difference is, remember, conventions are multilateral binding treaties, which means that any party to that treaty, any government that's ratified that convention, can bring a complaint against another government for failing to live up to its commitments under that treaty. So complaints are state to state, but it has to be that both states have ratified the convention in question. Those are relatively rare, as you can imagine. Governments really don't enjoy stepping into the role of telling governments they're not doing things that they're supposed to be doing vis-a-vis their citizens. They're usually only found in cases where the situation is so oppressive, like you're probably familiar with a complaint that was brought by various governments against Myanmar when the military junta was extracting forced labor, and the workers and employers were in too weak of a position to complain themselves. There was just too great a risk against them of violence if they were to bring a complaint. But that's why it's a rather rare procedure. But a very common procedure is the second body. It's also found in the Constitution, but it's separate. It's the Committee on Freedom of Association. So this body is composed of an employer, a worker, and a government representative, and they hear cases only on freedom of association or collective bargaining. And this is the unique thing about this, is that you do not have to, as a government, have ratified the instruments in question, because this is the one area where the ILO says, honestly, if you can't agree that freedom of association and collective bargaining are fundamental rights and you need to respect them, you're in the wrong club. You need to leave. So everyone who stays is deemed to have, by virtue of staying, consented to be subject to oversight on how they're giving effect to these conventions, even if they haven't ratified them. So that's what makes the Committee on Freedom of Association a little bit unusual. In all cases, I need to stress this very strongly, in all cases, the supervisory machinery, no matter what channel it is and whatever process it is only talking about the obligations of the state. It may be incidental that they end up discussing a particular company's actions because it is the basis of a complaint. Say a trade union that was, all their members were fired from a particular company in an act of discrimination. And as a matter of background information, they talk about the company. But if the issue is the action of the state, whether they stepped in and fixed the problem or they failed to step in and let the problem persist. But it's always the focus is the state. So why have ILS become a universal benchmark for business? Because it's not so obvious why multilateral binding treaties that are written for governments to implement or recommendations, why in the world a company would decide that's an awesome basis for a code of conduct or an industry initiative or a multi-stakeholder initiative. It really isn't that obvious, at least at first sight. But there are a couple of reasons. First of all, coherence. Remember I was talking before about gender and how we make sure gender is mainstreamed in all our instruments through a very meticulous checking that everything is coherent and anticipating problems. Well, we also do that in terms of each convention that precedes the next one. So each new convention, we look for potential clashes with what came before it, not only in terms of legal issues, but also in terms of mixed messages to governments and by extension companies. So even though it's a rather large set of instruments, there are over 200 conventions and I think 215 or so recommendations. They are quite coherent, partly because a lot of them it's not like there are 200 different topics being addressed in the conventions. It's that there are a handful of topics and they keep being replaced and updated by each other. But anyway, they're very coherent. The other issue is the credibility. If you are a company and you are worried about being attacked by NGOs for not doing enough or trade unions for not doing enough, and yet you want to be focused on your business, having your benchmarks be international labor standards where workers are already right there. They have agreed, this is what is a decent ask. This is a reasonable ask. It doesn't mean it's not unfair to ask more, but it is also not unfair for a company to say, well, actually, I'm comfortable here where the reasonable ask zone is. And it gives companies a lot more credibility than if they were to draw that line just on their own, arbitrarily or with their own little focus group of who knows who. But having 187 member states with workers represented by all 187 member states, it gives them a different level of credibility. And it also creates boundaries because, as I said, they are not foundations, they are not NGOs. Companies need to be companies. And it's important not only for them, but for the ILO, because remember, we're also obsessed with employment creation and economic development as ends in themselves, but also because those are prerequisites for protecting workers' rights. So we also want boundaries around companies so that there's not a never-ending pile on of companies, but that they are doing what they can and they should, that is reasonable to ask of them, but then that there's a point at which they need to be able to say, okay, I need to go back to my business now and focus on this. I can't really get involved in too many things outside of the workers' rights that are already defined in the conventions and recommendations. And it's also, last but not least, it's back to my history. I think if there's anything to remember from this presentation, it's that Emily loves quizzes and Emily loves history. And going back to history, this is going back before 1919. These are the two the ILO was the brainchild of these two men. They were contemporaries, but they're not writing together. They were writing separately, but almost the same time around the end of the 1800s. Robert Owen was a Welsh industrialist. He was famous for the way he treated his workers, but also aggressively advocating or passionately advocating for abolishing the trucking system in Britain, which is a system where work companies claw back the wages they paid the workers by inflating the cost of food and the cost of housing and other amenities that workers are dependent on the employers for. So he was very famous for that. And Daniel Legoin is was a Swiss industrialist operating in the Alsace region in France. And he was famous for setting a minimum age for his workers of 10 years, which sounds outrageous probably to you, but at that time, children started work around 4 or 5 years old. So getting an extra 5 years of education was truly revolutionary for an employer to do. And they were both writing about industrialization. They were talking about all the wonderful things that industrialization had brought, because everything was happening and society was changing so quickly. Technology was booming, production quality was accelerating, goods were so much more accessible to the average person. But they were also talking about the exponential increase in human suffering because of industrialization. And they were writing about the need to set a universal floor, because if we don't do something, industrialization will be destroyed before it even really gets a chance to take root because of all the human suffering. And they have to be international standards, not just national standards, because trade at this time was wide open. There were some tariffs, but it was still wide open. In some ways, it was more open than it is now. So they were recognizing that it's not enough for a government to take care of its workers. Governments have to agree on a certain set of standards so that all workers will be taken care of and that they can save industrialization. So that, and the first International Labor Conference actually preceded the First World War. It was in 1904. But at that time, governments weren't particularly motivated and it didn't go anywhere. It was after the First World War, with all the unemployment, the devastation, but also the Russian Revolution, that suddenly governments were motivated like they had never been to be able to take workers' rights seriously. So that's the origin of the ILO and why it's sort of like the circle completing itself. Business people thinking of the ILO and thinking of labor standards, going through a long process, and then suddenly business coming back and saying, yeah, we need international labor standards in our own operations. So just to close, where to find more information on international labor standards? Because as I told you, it's a 600 hump camel. Sometimes reading labor standards, they're not easy to understand. And even if you read the labor standard itself, you also need to understand a bit about what the Committee of Experts has said and the Committee on Freedom of Association to really make sense of it and to understand how it's been fleshed out since its adoption. So there are a few things for you. One is an easy to read book. It's sort of like an introduction to labor standards and how they relate to business. I think Carl has made it accessible to you on the platform. It's publicly available for free on the ILO's website, but I think Carl has put it into your resources so you don't have to hunt around for it. There's the Help Desk for Business, which I manage, and we have had questions from NCPs. What they ask is, I think there have been a total of about a half a dozen of them. And the way the questions are worded is, look, we have a case that involves this issue, and we need to understand what the conventions and recommendations and other ILO stuff says about this issue so that we're in a better position technically to facilitate a dialogue between the parties that we are trying to help out. So we give them a sort of background brief that they can share with each party. They can go over and digest on their own and then get together and talk about the implications of. There's also Normlex, which is a database. It's a composite actually of several databases. One that has the conventions and recommendations and the jurisprudence that goes with it. But another that has national legislation, because it may be helpful for you to actually understand not only the conventions and recommendations and what the Committee of Experts has said about it, but perhaps what the committee has said or other bodies have said specifically about the country concerned and what has triggered the specific instance, but also the national legislation. So you might want to look in the database and read up on the national law that's also informing how this company is operating at the local level. Even if your OECD guidelines are what is supposed to be guiding their practice, obviously they're informed by national law, and it may be that there's a potential conflict between the guidelines and national law that might be part of part of the problem for the company. So you might want to check that as well. And then we also have an internet guide on international labor standards that was developed for the course, and I believe Carl again has made that, put that in your sort of internet platform of goodies for you to take a look at. So my last poll, and then we'll stop there, I swear this is the last slide, is have any of you been involved in discussions about or used international labor standards in your work? And if so, does anyone want to take the floor and share your experience? Okay, back to the chat box. Okay, oh, I have a yes. 2 yeses. Okay, let's see, there's a fair number of you, partially. Of the yeses that are coming out, does anyone want to share their experience? Was it useful, painful, confusing? Who would like to take the floor? Anyone? You don't have to. If you're perhaps too traumatized, but if anyone wants to talk about their experience.
Well, I would like to just briefly, as I was that partially yes, because I was participating also on negotiation on the investment agreement with the China, where the question of the ratification, some basic ILO agreements was I think one of the hardest problem to solve. So it was a little bit painful, but we, as a European Union, managed to finally get some, well, at least somehow satisfactory result, with which we can agree. So that was the example where I could see how difficult this topic is, and how something what is quite common for us, or nothing really special, could be quite challenging in other I don't know, other country. That's it.
Well, your experience is likely to be relevant to many other countries. International labor standards are being used more and more. They appear more and more in international trade agreements, both bilateral and multilateral trade agreements. So, and to the extent that your national contact point, or you were having maybe several hats and are involved in discussions on trade agreements, yeah, you'll bump into those. That's a good observation. Anyone else want to share their experience? If not, I have one pending question here. Someone is asking why OSH isn't considered a fundamental, one of the fundamental principles in rights at work. I'll answer that, and then Annick, I think maybe you wanted to share your experience. I'll get back to you in just a moment. Just to answer briefly, as I mentioned earlier, the right to life is about as fundamental as it gets, but it's not necessarily a springboard for other rights, the way freedom of association and collective bargaining then can address a whole range of other rights, or forced labor is blocking off from the worker a whole range of rights. So when you think of fundamental, don't think of, it was bad marketing, I think, in a way, because fundamental implies it's really, really base, really, really essential. And OSH is really, really essential. But fundamental in this context means that they are rights in themselves, but also enabling rights that help support other rights. if that makes sense, hopefully. And they did discuss during the centennial, we turned 100 years old in 2019. And as part of that exercise, they discussed, should we put the OSH in the fundamental principles and rights at work? But they decided, no, we're going to keep it as the enabling rights, as critical as OSH is. And instead we have an entire rather huge program on strengthening OSH systems and labor-related, OSH-related labor inspection. So Annick, would you like to share your experience?
Yes, I was not personally involved in the negotiation of the new instruments, but well in the use of it. For instance, it's important to use the Fundamental Convention 98 in the national labor industrial relations, and I give two examples. For instance, when there is a collective labor agreement with some commitments in order to respect notice periods in case of strike actions. So it's a voluntary commitment by the trade unions in a collective labor agreement. It's important that the trade unions, the national trade unions who committed themselves also comply with their own commitments. Otherwise, there is no trust possible in the industrial relations. So and we use that as a fundamental principle of the ILO. And also in strike actions, for instance, it's not allowed to put pressure on the employer to violate the legislation, because also in the Convention 98, it's put that the trade unions and the employers' organizations who are recognized have to comply with the law. So that's two examples.
Okay, yeah, and did you find the instruments hard to use, or they were okay?
And we use the decisions of the Committee of Freedom of Association.
Yeah, especially for 87, Convention 87 and 98, if you don't look at that digest, you'll miss like yes. 3/4 of the picture. So it's very good that you use the digest. Excellent. Yeah, and I'm glad to know that it helped you in facilitating the dialogue. Great. Any other comments or questions? I don't want to keep you, I don't even know what time it is because my screen, 6:30. So we need to stop unless there's another burning question. I'll turn it back over to you, Carl, and I apologize for going over a little bit, or actually quite a bit.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you. It's fine, and you apologize. So I'm the time management police here, huh? So I have to keep an eye on the clock. But no, thanks, Emily. I think now you were able to lay the foundations for the next 3 weeks. Have this basic understanding of the concepts that we will be using in the discussions in the weeks to come. Just quickly to check, everybody can see my screen? Yes, okay. Here are the references that Emily was referring to. Rules of the Game, a great publication which was updated in 2019. It's this handy guide. It's almost a guide for dummies on international labor standards with short descriptions about the conventions and a good summary of what Emily presented today. For those that really want to know more, that now are really curious about the ins and outs of international labor standards, on the ILO website, there is a free course on Introduction to International Labor Standards, not necessarily from this business perspective, but it goes deeper into the different standard setting procedure that Emily touched upon. And then finally, the ILO Help Desk for Business. There is a direct link on the eCampus. It will give you access to the ILO Help Desk for Business, and we also will upload a short video where Emily explains in depth the ILO Help Desk for Business. It's one of the operational tools of the ILO M&E declaration for your information, which also will be the topic on Wednesday. Okay, homework. I'm just kidding. I don't want to call it homework. I just call it a small assignment of a few minutes, huh? As a way of preparing yourself for the session on Wednesday on the M&E declaration with Gita Roelants. We also developed a few years ago what we call a self-guided learning model on the M&E declaration. I think it's a 45-minute during self-guided e-learning exercise. It depends on how quickly you can click, because that is the basic dynamic of the e-learning course. You have to click through the course. It will give you different situations where we apply the M&E declaration. And I think it might be very useful for the session on Wednesday. In that regard, you already come in with a very well-informed position on the M&E declaration, and you might already have some questions that you would like to raise with Gita. So this is what we call the assignment that you could do, that we suggest you to do before the webinar that we have on Wednesday. You will find also all the instruction on the eCampus. It will bring you to another website, and you even will earn a certificate. Then you already have a certificate even on the first day of the course. Good. So final slide. Next Wednesday from 2 to 4. I think it will actually. I'm not sure. I think we will be finishing earlier than 4, but let's say it's planned from 2 to 4. The session with Gita Roelants on the ILO M&E declaration. Already start thinking about specific questions that you have for Gita. This is the opportunity and the moment to ask them. And this session will focus on the M&E declaration. So thank you for your patience. Apologies also for going over the allotted time. It's now 40 past 4, 4:40. So it's time to wrap up. And for those that are joining us from the other side of the world, like from Australia, well, good night. And for the rest from Southern America, have a great day ahead. And for all the rest, we see each other on Wednesday. Oh, I just want to highlight, please go to the pre-course activities, especially the introduction forum. It's also a way of getting to know each other. And post a nice picture. It makes it so much nicer, your post. Okay? Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye, Emily. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.